Well, hello, all you zanies out there. No, I'm not going to refer to you as all you zanies out there. I'm referring to you sitting in front of your TV set or your computer. What a fun time we're going to have. For the next hour and 15 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to tonight's film, The Man of the Forest, starring Randolph Scott. But you might be asking the question, Dark, have you gone out of your mind? I mean, the film is Man of the Forest and you've got this poster back here for Western Union. Have you really lost your mind? Well, of course I've lost my mind. I'm retired, but I'll try and focus for the next 15 minutes or so in talking about Man of the Forest. And the reason this poster is up here is because this is the last big budgeted Zane Grey based film from the Hollywood classic era, and it stars tonight's star, Randolph Scott. This was his last of 8 performances in Zane Grey-based motion pictures. So you got a veteran Zane Greyer in Randolph Scott. When he made this film very early in his career at age 35. So tonight, I've been trying to figure out a way, how do I introduce a film like this that probably nearly no one has seen before, and I would say many zanies have never seen before. So I've chosen to introduce it in 3 ways. First, sausages. Second, cheap. Third, star-studded. So first, sausages. By the early 1930s, the American Western had become a staple to moviegoers. And it was also during this decade that moviegoing in general became a national habit. Coincidentally, as we well know, the 1920s was the most lucrative decade for our favorite author, Zane Grey. So this was a wonderful decade. Westerns were big budgeted, very important productions, such as The Covered Wagon in 1923, The Trail of '98, and Zane Grey's own The Vanishing American that we saw at the convention in Durango. The decade ended with one of the biggest Westerns ever made, called The Big Trail in 1930, and it starred a very, very young, boyish John Wayne. And it was big in 3 respects. The biggest budget of any Western, it had the biggest visual appeal on the screen because it debuted a widescreen process called grandeur. And it also had a 3rd distinction in terms of big. It was the biggest box office failure of 1930. So what was the impact of that? Well, that quickly communicated to filmmakers that Westerns were not moneymakers anymore. They thought Americans and audiences worldwide wanted musicals with the new invention of sound. So they went in that direction. What happened to Westerns? Well, they were relegated to being shown in neighborhood theaters. Budgets were cut tremendously. The running time was limited to about 1 hour, and they became known with sometimes the derisive terminology of odors, sagebrush sagas, shoot-'em-ups, and horse operas. Now, this last designation comes from the fact that many Westerns turned into singing Westerns with Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, and Dick Foran. These formulaic Westerns were just ground out like sausages by studios large and small. And unfortunately, Westerns taken from the Zane Grey novels fell into this regrettable category, aided and abetted by the precipitous decline in movie revenues during the depths of the Great Depression. Nevertheless, there was a silver lining of sorts to this otherwise dismal assessment. As we saw at previous conventions when we screened the 1931 versions of Riders of the Purple Sage and The Rainbow Trail, you remember that? Directors took their cameras to some really gorgeous locations that included the Grand Canyon, and various other locations in Arizona, California, and Utah. Fortunately, one of Hollywood's great directors, Henry Hathaway, cut his teeth on movie westerns very early in his career. Now, Hathaway made a career total of 67 feature films during his prolific career. 6 of them were directed or starred John Wayne. See if you can remember them. How the West Was Won, North to Alaska, The Sons of Katie Elder, Circus World, The Shepherd of the Hills, a 1941 Western, when John Wayne was still pretty young. And also the great True Grit, okay? He also directed a very path-breaking 1936 Western, The Trail of the Lonesome Pine, the first film shot entirely outdoors in the newly perfected process of Technicolor. It was also Hathaway's preference to shoot his Westerns entirely outdoors. Instead of using stage sets, which was more economical for studios, he insisted on this. And that's why his Zane Grey Westerns, on threadbare budgets and formulaic, that's why they're so much fun to watch. They're beautifully photographed and they're all outdoors. Now, the location for tonight's film, Man of the Forest, as near as I can determine, is the region surrounding an area called Cedar Lake near Big Bear in the San Bernardino Mountains of Southern California. It's a scenic location. Hathaway used it for several of his films, and it really wasn't that far, relatively speaking, from the Paramount Pictures studio lot, about 100 miles. Also, Hathaway had a great feel for Zane Grey stories. His first movie as a credited director was a Zane Grey-based film, The Heritage of the Desert, in 1932. Man of the Forest was Hathaway's 5th Zane Grey-based motion picture. All 8 Grey-based features that Hathaway directed were made in a very concentrated period of time, between 1932 and 1934. Now, to our third category, star-studded. At the time Man of the Forest was made, director Hathaway was the same age, 35, as the film's star, Randolph Scott. But I will get to Scott in a few minutes. I want to first direct our attention to familiar folks who appear with Randolph Scott in this film. They're often called character actors. I like to call them stars too. These are the familiar folks that you see in so many movies of the classic era. They feel like old friends that you've invited into your home, and you're anxious to see them again. And from our perspective in 2020, most of these are really memorable characters because we know the films they were in after this time period. So we can get an enjoyment out of watching Man of the Forest that people didn't get when they watched it in 1933, because we've seen so many films with these. Let me perhaps least known. Let me give you the name of Verna Hilly. Now, anybody remember Verna Hilly? Can you even name one film in which she starred? If you can, I'm going to give you a surprise. I don't know what that surprise is going to be because I don't think you can win that prize. Why? Verna Hilly, who plays Alice Gaynor, Scott's love interest in tonight's movie, only appeared in 18 films during her brief 9-year career that began in 1932. However, she did appear in another Zane Grey movie, Under the Tonto Rim, made the year before. Hilly also appeared in 2 movies out of her 18 with a young John Wayne in his really cheap Western period in the early 1930s. So that's Verna Hilly. Now we're going to get to people I think you'll recognize more. How about the name Harry Carey? Yeah, you know who he is. Harry Carey was a legend in Hollywood, and not just for his appearance in Westerns. He appeared in 259 feature films during his long career. Moviegoers loved him in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Trader Horn, the first Hollywood feature film shot entirely on the continent of Africa in 1931, all the way up to his last film performance and the year of his death in 1947, and the movie Red River, in which he appeared with his son, Harry Carey Jr., his first film. What kind of character did Harry Carey play in movies? A man of decency, upright, common sense, a man of honor. And he does that in tonight's film as he plays rancher Jim Gaynor. Carey also appeared in two other Grey-based films that Hathaway directed, Sunset Pass and The Thundering Herd. So that's the great Harry Carey. This name you'll also recognize. Buster Crabbe, who plays the bad guy, Yegg. That's right, Y-E-G-G. He's a bad guy. He's a villain in this one. But at the time he started in movies in the early 30s, Buster Crabbe was well known as an Olympic prize-winning swimmer when he was enticed by Hollywood to try his hand at the movies. To Buster Crabbe, it was either go to law school or be in the movies. He thought he'd try the movies. They attempted to make him a rival to Johnny Weissmuller for other Tarzan movies, but that didn't work out so well. So he began appearing in a number of Zane Grey-based films in the early 1930s that include not only tonight's film, but To the Last Man and The Thundering Herd. Just 3 years after appearing in Man of the Forest, Crabbe would be best known to people worldwide as Flash Gordon and as Buck Rogers in a series of multi-chaptered serials between 1936 and 1940. But Crabbe actually made more Westerns than any other type of film. And he would appear in other Zane Grey-based films, Wanderer of the Wasteland, Nevada, Drift Fence, Desert Gold, and Forlorn River. You remember, we saw Forlorn River at the convention at BYU in 2013. The next one, you may not recognize his name, but you'll certainly recognize him when you see him on the screen. Barton McLean. This husky, gravelly voiced actor is recognizable in many famous Hollywood films, such as The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, The Maltese Falcon, and Bullets or Ballots with Edward G. Robinson. He often played a gangster type character. Those are just a few of the 200 films in which he appeared from the 1920s to the 1950s. He plays Mulvey, another henchman, along with Yegg in tonight's film. You will also remember him as Jack Slade, Randolph Scott's younger brother, who dressed up as an Indian and burned out the Western Union camp in the movie of the poster in back of me. I think you'll remember him now. But now I'm going to get to somebody who wins the grand prize tonight for being in more Zane Grey movies than any of the other performers, including Randolph Scott in tonight's film. His name, Noah Beery. Now, Beery appeared, this isn't Wallace Beery, this is Noah Beery. Beery appeared in dozens of silent films, but was distinguished in movies of the early sound period by his deep, basso profundo voice, his hulking physique, and his Simon Legree-like mustache. He is the perfect movie villain. And I would hope that Zane Grey felt the same way when he saw him in this film, as well as the previous films. He plays Clint Beasley, who leads Yegg and Mulvey to get Jim Gaynor's land away from him. And it's Beery who makes such a tremendous impression here. So how does he beat the sweepstakes for being in more Zane Grey films than any of the other performers in this film tonight? He was in 11 Zane Grey based films, going all the way back to 1923 in the silent version of To the Last Man. And you might remember him as Booker in The Vanishing American and as the evil Judge Dyer in the 1931 version that we saw of Riders of the Purple Sage. Beery also left a legacy to the movie industry in the form of his actor son, Noah Beery Jr. You've seen him in a number of Westerns in the 1940s and 50s, but you'll perhaps remember him most of all for his 8-year stint with the great James Garner in The Rockford Files on television. That's Noah Beery Jr. But then you might ask, what about Wallace Beery? Wallace Beery was Noah Beery's brother. Okay, so now you know all about the Beerys. Now to our featured star, Randolph Scott. One could argue that Randolph Scott is identified with more Westerns than any other actor. And, you know, I will, for argument's sake, I'll include John Wayne in that category. Why do some people say Scott is identified more with Westerns than anybody else? Well, between 1932 and 1959, Randolph Scott appeared in one or more Westerns every one of those years, except one, 1945. His first credited Western film was a Western, The Heritage of the Desert, in 1932, directed by Henry Hathaway. His last film, a Western, 30 years later in 1962, Ride the High Country. However, Randolph Scott appeared in just about every kind of film because he was always a good box office draw. Randolph Scott was born in Virginia and evidenced an early interest in acting, something that his well-connected father recognized. And being well-connected, his dad got him together with Howard Hughes, who had formed his own motion picture studio. Well, this was in the late 1920s, and it got Randolph Scott only uncredited bit parts. In fact, Randolph Scott was even the dialogue coach for Gary Cooper on the 1929 talking version of The Great Virginian, okay? He plays Brett Dale in tonight's film, a seemingly independent woodsman who has cougars for pets. Yeah, well, and remember, these are 1 hour long, threadbare scripts. They don't explain any of this stuff. He just has cougars for pets, lives alone in the mountains. He has a lot of friends in the region, including Jim Gaynor, played by Harry Carey, and he helps Gaynor fight Beasley and his henchmen who are trying to get Gaynor's land for the water rights. And as mentioned earlier, Randolph Scott starred in a total of 8 films based on Zane Grey novels. So we're gonna have a lot of fun tonight, more fun than audiences had in 1933, because we've seen all these great actors and what they became afterwards. Now, there's a final 2 actors that have small parts in the film that I think classic moviegoers like you would recognize. They're in this film for comic relief. One of them is named Gwyn Williams, who had a nickname Big Boy. And the other is a small, kind of wimpy looking mustached character named Vince Barnett. You'll recognize them in the film. So, just for you zanies, tonight we have a lot of fun. A good movie that doesn't wear out its welcome. Man of the Forest. I know you're going to enjoy it.